All right, well, good evening, everyone. So glad everyone was able to make it. I know there are folks still trickling in. We've got some notes floating around. We've got some more notes getting printed. I think we're starting to run out just a little bit. However, we are going to jump right in this evening. Our first two nights in this Truth Rising series, we are going to watch the first half and then the second half of the documentary itself. So we've got about 45 minutes of the documentary to watch this evening, and then we'll walk through some of the things talked about in that first half, and second half we'll do the same thing the following week. What I plan on doing the several weeks after that is going through what I believe to be the most significant issues that are raised by the documentary itself and the issues around the documentary. A lot of this is about what's going on in Western civilization. Yeah, I am deeply motivated by the idea of what does it mean for the Judeo-Christian tradition to have created Western civilization as we know it, what's being lost, what is potentially being lost, and why, and how is it specifically the Judeo-Christian tradition built what you and I take for granted in the Western world. So that sort of lays a little bit of the groundwork. We're going to go ahead and start the documentary, and then we will join back together here in about 45 minutes.
Angkor Wat is famously the largest religious ruin on the planet. The temple is situated facing westward, which is somewhat unusual, and is built to mimic the universe, according to Hindu understanding. For centuries, Angkor represented the crowning achievement of the ancient Khmer Empire. And yet, for all its splendor, it was eventually abandoned. In time, the city was swallowed by the jungle and all but forgotten, until it was rediscovered by Europeans not so very long ago. But of course, Angkor's fate is hardly unique. The same story is played out time and again. The Parthenon, the great Aztec and Mayan temples of Mexico, the pyramids at Giza, which stood for 1,000 years before Moses. These once great monuments to the unassailable near godlike power of the pharaohs now serve as the backdrop to tourist social media posts. But why? Why do civilizations rise, flourish, and fall? And more importantly, is there any alternative to decline and fall? What of our own civilization? Today it seems particularly chaotic, divided, ashamed of its past, and disconnected from its foundation, teetering on the edge. Indeed, evidence for the decline of the West can be seen all around us. Is there anything we can do at this late stage, or are decline and fall inevitable? I'm now in my 80s. And I've decided to retrace a journey I first made in my 20s, but this time with the perspective of all that has happened since then. I've spent my career, some 60-odd years, thinking, studying, debating, and writing about the great questions of human existence. I consider this the calling God has placed on my life. And yet, the questions I've spent my lifetime wrestling with have never been more urgent than right now. I believe that we are at a civilizational moment. What do I mean by that? The civilizational moment is a period of crisis when a civilization, our civilization, completely loses touch with the inspiration that made it what it is. In other words, our foundational inspiration, our original dynamism is gone. We've lost it. It is at this point, like all the other civilizations that have come and gone before us, that we face three clear options: renew the original inspiration, replace it, or decline. That's why I've come to Rome, perhaps the world's greatest monument to civilizational decline and fall. There is no question that once again the crisis is most urgent and the hour most advanced here in Europe. I've come back to reflect on the clarity and courage that we need in this troubled time. It is my conviction that we all have a decisive choice before us. Of course, I'm not alone in sensing the gravity of the moment. It's in the air. We're all feeling it at some level. To begin my journey, I'm meeting three friends, cultural experts, who've given great thought to the special role Western civilization has played in creating the world we live in today. Baroness Philippa Stroud, a member of the British House of Lords and co-founder of ARC, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. The Honourable John Anderson, a former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia and a much-followed podcaster and political commentator. And Sir Neil Ferguson, an eminent Oxford and Harvard historian and senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute.
Civilizations, I think, are things that over time are passed from generation to generation. You might call them the operating system of a society.
Well, if a civilization is a culture where people share values and ideas and beliefs, and that culture becomes significant enough to be, if you like, recognized historically and in its own time as dominant.
When I look at the world over the last 500 years, it seems to me that we can tell a story in which one complex of ideas and institutions came to be very dominant over the others. Those countries of Western Europe, with a predominantly Christian heritage, had become very distinct in their ways of doing things from the other civilizations that they encountered when they traveled around the world.
Western civilization really born with a lot of influence from the old thinking from the Greco-Roman world, but particularly fused with the very significant insistence that we find in Christianity of respect for a higher authority and the sort of morals that go with it. But also this absolute insistence that every individual has worth, has value, has standing, because they're made in the image of a creator.
The most extraordinary building block and foundation stone of the West is the dignity of every single human being. I mean, that's a profoundly radical thought. Obviously, that came out of the Judeo-Christian foundation, and that truth sent ripples and waves right the way through our civilization. It was the turning point and the foundational building block of everything that we know today.
I have often spoken and written on the importance of Western civilization, how it is unique in human history, and why it is worth maintaining. But it never fails to amaze me how frequently we need to remind ourselves of its successes and how often they are taken for granted by its beneficiaries. Indeed, it is often those, like me, who were born outside the West who most deeply appreciate what is distinctive and valuable about Western culture. This is certainly true for my friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Somali-born writer, activist, who now lives in the West and defends it with remarkable courage. And few, perhaps, are able to describe and dissect attacks on the West with as much insight as David Berlinski, an American mathematician, professor, and philosopher, now living in Paris.
Every civilization has a history, and if you say, why did mathematics of a certain kind, why did science of a certain kind arise in 16th, 17th, 18th century Europe? Of course, some part of the explanation will be the history of this culture. And that's unmistakably Greek, Judeo-Christian in its nature. These are ideas that belong to the history of Western culture. They don't really belong to the history of another culture.
As a Westerner, you don't have to imagine how life would be under Islam or under communism. All you have to do is buy a plane ticket and go to any of these places that Western civilization has barely touched and spend some time there. The level of education you will get is much better than years and years at Harvard. For me as a child, I remember up until I came to the Netherlands, leading a life of never having enough of anything. There were always conversations about food, about water, about electricity. Don't even get me started on diseases. We were dying of things that the West had completely forgotten about. The next thing I thought was amazing about the Netherlands was, how do you organize people for the common good instead of for the selfish collective clan or tribal thing, which leads us to this constant cycle of violence where we're never able to build anything? How can we create something that's sustainable? Again, the West did a really fantastic job of that.
When Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in the early 19th century, he was amazed to see the strength of American local communities. Americans do all these things for themselves. They have associations. When a problem arises, they don't expect the government to come and deal with it. And in his eyes, that was what made American democracy so vibrant, this local associational life. But he also noticed, as Max Weber did later when he came to America, that religion played a pretty important part in knitting America's widely spread out communities together. When I first came to the United States to work, which is now more than 20 years ago, there still seemed a clear difference. Americans seemed more believing and more observant in religious terms than their European counterparts. But that difference is fading, particularly since COVID. American churches start to look quite empty.
I do think our civilization is at tipping point. And I think our options are very limited, but I think we can already see that the alternative fuels that we've tried to put into the great engines of democracy have failed. The great engines really were the Judeo-Christian concepts of accountability to a higher authority, coupled with doing the right thing by your neighbour, loving your neighbour. They've been massively diminished. And in the name of identity now, it's all about me. I am God over my life. I will choose who I will be. My identity is mine. You'll be deeply offending me if you dare to challenge that identity. And that fragmentation, it has made it extremely difficult for leaders in a democracy to appeal to a common good, to a common weal.
We're living through a kind of radical dismantling of social bonds. Families are not so tightly knit as they used to be. Workplaces have in many cases faded away. People work from home, which is a complete contradiction in terms by the standards of, say, the 1950s. And religious communities are much, much weaker than they were before. Is it any wonder that there's this great wave of despair? I don't think we can blame it all on smartphones and social media. It's much more profound than that.
Radical individualism, the new fuel that we've tried to put into the machine, has it coughing and spluttering and looking like it's going to die. And people ought to be utterly realistic. This will not be fun if we allow ourselves to go down that road.
It was nearly 60 years ago when I first drove up into the Alps and walked through the doors of L'Abri, the little study center and community to which thousands were drawn in the 1960s. I had recently graduated from university, steeped in the times, the counterculture of the 60s, seeking to make sense of the extraordinary times that were exploding around us. L'Abri was revolutionary for me. It was where my faith was deepened and expanded, and my understanding of our momentous generation was first set on a fruitful path. It was where I was mentored by the Christian visionary, Francis Schaeffer. It was where I met my beautiful and beloved wife, Jenny. I spent countless hours in and around these mountains, hiking, thinking, debating, praying. And it is here that my faith, my family heritage, and my own sense of calling all came together to be the central inspiration of my life. My ancestor was a barefoot shepherd from County Kildare whose grandson had a knack for making good beer. And I'm descended from the youngest son of Arthur Guinness. And what many people don't realize was he came to faith through the revival under John Wesley. And he was an ardent Christian ever since then. So my side of the family has kept the faith ever since. My grandfather went to China as a doctor in the late 1890s. He survived the Boxer Rebellion and founded one of the first Western hospitals in China. Both my parents were born there, although they went back as missionaries in the 1930s. I was born in 1941 in a small, nondescript village in north-central China in the year that many people consider the low point of the whole 20th century. Pearl Harbor in the US, the plans for the Holocaust under Hitler, and the first proposals for the atomic bomb, which so changed the world. But we were in an area caught between three armies. The Japanese had invaded on one side, and they killed 17 million in the invasion, including the horrendous rape of Nanking, the most savage and brutal massacre in the whole 20th century. On the other side, we had the communists, and on the third side, we had the nationalists. To stop the Japanese, the Chinese flooded the dikes of the Yellow River, and they killed 900,000 of their own people overnight. We were caught in a terrible famine in 1943. 5 million died in 3 months. My mother was a surgeon, but there was nothing she could do. There was no medicine, no food. There was cannibalism, people selling their children for an evening meal. And when my parents and I joined the refugee crowd looking for food and shelter, there were 10 million on the road. But we made our way slowly to the west of China and then flew over the Himalayas into India, which was British, and so escaped that way. But as soon as the war was over, We went back to China and to Nanjing today. It was the capital of so-called Free China, but you could feel the Red Army coming closer and closer and closer, and the fear mounting. And I will never forget the day in January 1949 when my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has just abandoned the city to the Red Army. We're at their mercy." And in they came. They festooned the town with loudspeakers, and in the morning, there were trials. In the afternoon, executions. We were there during the first 2 years of the Reign of Terror. So my first 10 years were a crash course in the realism about life. War, violence, revolution, famine, death. I'd seen dead bodies all over the place. And then, of course, the realism politically of what the Marxists are really like when they gain power. Their revolutions never succeed. Their oppressions never end. And their promised futures never arrive. And that, of course, is the story of the history of Marxism. And I saw it firsthand as a boy. And I will never forget it. Over the years, I have held countless conversations, both with individuals and with groups, on the topic of calling and how to engage with our modern culture. I'm always asked, well, that's all well and good, but what should I do about it? And of course, that's the hardest question to answer. And so on the individual level, what can any of us in our own lives truly do to encourage renewal?
There's an enormous temptation to say it was better before, it's going to the dogs now. And I'm going to give into that temptation completely. It seems to me that we are going to the dogs. The world is spinning out of control. Fundamental principles are being neglected. Democracy as a system or political arrangement is under ceaseless attack in the United States, but certainly in large parts of Europe as well. There is a great deal of uninformed speculation about the appropriate forms of government, the appropriate limits of government. The only thing that I can see very clearly is that all governments, all structures of authorities have become profoundly weakened. Religious, moral, psychological, philosophical. They've just become profoundly weakened.
The West has a great deal of material prosperity. Economically, militarily, culturally, all of these areas, the West is the biggest winner. But when it comes to identity, who am I, and what's the meaning and purpose of life? Why am I here, and what am I going to do with the rest of my life? What am I going to leave behind? The West seems to have dropped that ball. And they've done it in the most dangerous time for, I think, all humanity.
Identity politics, wokeness, political correctness, all the current shibboleths and cliches, which are hard to define but meaningless nonetheless. We all understand what it means to be woke.
We've emphasized what's bad about us. We've emphasized everything in Western history we can find that is awful. And everything else that is good, we're just letting it go.
It's always easy to have dumb people running things, because there are a lot more dumb people than smart people. And unfortunately, gaining access to power in a democratic society is not necessarily a function of intelligence. Why have all the institutions of authority more or less collapsed? I mean, you have dumb people in a position of authority, and for a long time they run things. But since the 60s, almost every institution of authority seems to have undergone an internal dissolution and collapse. Certainly it doesn't command respect. Is there anyone who deeply respects the Department of Motor Vehicles, the Internal Revenue Service, the Secret Service, Congress? All the organs of government, all the organs of art, all the organs of culture seem deeply compromised. Compromised not only by stupidity, by an ideological bias that everyone on earth finds repugnant. That's an interesting question. Why'd that happen?
What do we mean when we talk about wokeism? I think the answer is that it's a pseudo-religion. Wokeism is a kind of cult. You do strange things like announce your preferred pronouns at the beginning of meetings, which is a kind of weird social innovation. You use cultish language that nobody else uses in the real world, like intersectionality, a word that I think no ordinary American would be able to define.
So now it's cultural communism. It's not about the proletariat, the haves and the have-nots. It's about a dividing society into the oppressor and the oppressed. And the oppressor is the white, heterosexual male. Christianity is seen as the religion of the white, heterosexual male. Western civilization is seen as the fruits of the white, heterosexual male. So there is this campaign to destroy all of that. Radical political Islam finds the West in this state and thinks this is a very easy takeover. We don't actually have to be taking planes and driving them into tall buildings anymore. We can do it a different way. Take advantage of the woke. They're saying their society is rotten to the core. Their society is oppressive. Why don't we just go in and offer them something different? To my amazement, radical political Islam is settled in Europe and in America. Europe is increasingly looking more and more like Mogadishu.
It certainly should be a moment of deep reflection, but it's also a moment of danger because we see what's possible in the unraveling of a civilization. And it's very, very easy to unravel a civilization. A man who could not build a pigsty can nonetheless destroy a chateau. And I think that's true of civilization. People who could not in a million years put together a civilization are perfectly capable of destroying it.
Here we are in Paris. And the French Revolution in 1789 is one of the volcanic events that have helped to shape the entire modern world. The climax of the American Revolution was 10:30 a.m. on October 1781 at the siege of Yorktown. And the British troops, when they were ordered to surrender, they were asked to play the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." And that was actually a Christian view of revolution from the English Revolution in the 17th century. God creates order, humans create disorder, so God works on a disordered world to turn it the right way up, and that is revolution. The English and the American revolutions are similar compared with the big later three, which are the French, 1789, the Russian, 1917, and the Chinese, 1949, because the English and the American both came out of roots in the Bible. The American Revolution and the English Revolution take the biblical idea seriously that people, humans, abuse power. So you have the notion of the separation of powers and checks and balances, which John Witherspoon taught to James Madison, and you see very, very clearly in Federalist 51 and in the US Constitution. The French Revolution is utopian, anti-biblical, and anti-religious, and anti-Christian. And there's always a link between utopianism and violence. Because when there's a gap between the ideal and the real, you have to bridge the gap, and you do it by force, coercion, manipulation, violence. And that's why, for example, the Chinese Revolution probably killed 50 to 75 million of their fellow Chinese. So we need to understand what happened here and how it's in complete contrast to the American Revolution. Tragically, many Americans are increasingly aware of radical Marxism and its roots. And in essence, what I'm trying to say to Americans, you came to freedom through one revolution, which had its roots in the Bible, and now you're increasingly following another revolution, which has its roots in everything that rejects the Bible. Americans have to choose which revolution and its principles they're going to follow. My father, leaving China, said his one deep sadness was leaving 2 little graves behind, my brothers, who died. And 4 of our family are buried in China. But I knew why they were doing it and what it cost them, and I knew they loved me. Only the Lord knows why I survived and my 2 brothers didn't. Although humanly, the practical reason was, as we were on the road, and I was very, very sick, as they had been, a goat herd came to my mother, and Chinese venerated Western medicine. And the goat herd said, "Can I come with you and I'll be safe?" And she said, "Of course, if you can keep up." And it was his scrawny goats that gave just the minimum of goat's milk on which I survived and eventually came round. So I'm grateful to goat's milk and love it ever since. It leaves you with the experience which many survivors have. Why not me? It gives an added impetus to the sense of calling. I owe the Lord inexpressible gratitude for my life when my brothers didn't. There are wonderful poems from World War I, one of them by Lawrence Binyon. They shall not grow old as we who are left will grow old. And I often think of that even now in my 80s. They died under 5. I lived. And I've got to make sure that I return my life and serve the Lord in thanks for giving me life when they didn't have it. I've decided to end my European journey in London. Fitting, perhaps, as nowhere else in Europe can this civilizational moment be more clearly felt than back home here in the United Kingdom. But where the crisis is deepest, there's a new movement of courage rising. I've come to speak with 2 young men who represent a glimmer of hope for the future. Konstantin Kissin is an immigrant from Russia, turned British patriot. A comedian by trade, he turned to cultural commentary in order to advocate for the truth. And Winston Marshall, an eminently talented musician and founding member of the band Mumford & Sons, who was cancelled for a tweet supportive of a book critical of the BLM movement and the Antifa riots in 2020.
I triggered a huge dogpile. Within a couple of days, it was in all the newspapers. It was a segment on Tucker and The View, and under considerable duress, I published an apology letter. The band made me take time away to examine my quote-unquote blind spots. And after a few coming months, I decided that, having really looked into this issue of far-left extremism in America, I had not been wrong, and that those things were bad. And yes, I might have gone against the prevailing thought of the industry, but it was more important to stand by my principles.
And you said publicly that you didn't want to self-censor, but you must have had some strong alternative on which you wanted to stand.
Well, the truth. The job of the artist is to tell the truth. I couldn't continue having been part of this lie, and I also knew that the truth could be damaging to the band professionally. And so it seemed that the only way forward was for me to retract my apology, stand by what I'd originally said, and to save them the trouble, move away from the band.
Do you see this radical, in this case Marxism with BMM, as a wider problem with European young people?
Absolutely. This is the most evil ideology that Europe has ever come up with. It's more evil than Nazism because it killed more people. Some reason we have not educated our children on Marxism. I wonder how many kids really even know about Mao. Marxism is the opposite of, it's anti-human, and yet it's extremely popular, and it's an idea that doesn't die.
You have radical Marxism, cultural Marxism. You have the sexual revolution. And now you have Islamism. So those same three radical forces are powerfully in America. And in education, they've gaslighted American history. So many Americans no longer are proud to be American or have confidence in their history. You know, we are racist, xenophobic, imperialistic, and all the nasty things that are said.
I always say to people, I love this country, and I say so publicly, which is how you know I'm not really British. I don't remember feeling that. I don't remember people being embarrassed about being British at the time, which increasingly people do seem to be. It feels to me, at least, that this has happened in my lifetime. For me, it was probably around 2015, 2016, when I just started to notice that some of the things that people were saying were just like, they made zero sense to me. They would say, oh, you know, the reason half the country voted for Brexit is because they're all racist. And I was like, I've lived in this country as a foreigner my entire life. Someone's been rude to me once because I'm foreign. That's fewer times than someone's been rude to me in Russia. A lot of people are so brainwashed into this way of thinking, and everything that they're being told is so decontextualized from history.
What to you is the heart of the best of the West?
The thing that really stands out to me experientially is the sanctity of the individual. It's the idea that actually every person matters, and this is simply not true in every other place in the world. Question is, you said we're in a civilizational moment, and I agree with you. I think the West is in danger of causing its own decline by losing its confidence in itself. And if we do that, then we will be in decline, and things will really, really be terrible, not just for us, but for everybody. The West's dominance around the world has been what has ensured that the greatest number of people around the world have been lifted out of poverty, have been given freedoms that they didn't have before, have enjoyed opportunities that they didn't have before. We are the greatest civilization in human history. This is an undeniable fact. And we still have everything we need to remain that, should we choose to do so.
People are terrified to tell the truth. And we have a society of cowards. And it's time for people to stop caring and to put the truth first, because it's a fast track to totalitarianism.
All the other threats that we face would be dramatically diminished if we took ourselves and our values seriously, and we're prepared to stand up for our values, to advance those values, to believe in them, to teach them to our children, to encourage them to see the society from which they come as a good society, as a society that has merit, that has delivered things for its own citizens and the rest of the world.
And there's such evil that's being done because people are scared to speak up. Look what's happening in trans ideology, butchering our children at the taxpayers' expense. Look what is happening with the grooming gangs in this country. Politicians, the police themselves, and the media are terrified to talk about the tens of thousands of white girls who have been raped, and some of them killed because they are white, because they're scared of it being politically incorrect, seeming racist. Do you realize what evil is being done because you don't have the courage to speak up?
We have weakened ourselves spiritually more than anything. We can't survive a loss of that belief. It's time to start painting all of this postmodernist, relativist, the West is evil, all cultures are equal or whatever. It's time for that to become the stale, old, boring narrative, and for the next generation of young people to rebel against that.
I actually really care that we're losing our civilization, and my concentration is more on our country. I'm very patriotic. I don't want it to be our generation that Britain was lost, and that means we've got to fight for it.
As my journey in Europe draws to a close, I am left with a profound sense of the magnitude of the crisis. A crisis that now faces every one of us, whether we realize it or not. That we, on an individual level, will all need to engage with the urgency of the moment. To pursue the more practical side of renewal, I have decided to continue to the United States, to Washington, D.C., in order to meet with my friend John Stonestreet, whose whole life is dedicated to just that goal. John is someone who truly understands the times. In many ways, he and I are similar, although he has the advantage of youth. As president of the Colson Center, his mission is to equip people to live with clarity, confidence, and purpose, and with the lens of a Christian worldview. John has reached millions through his speaking engagements and his Breakpoint radio broadcast. He too has been called to think and write about where we have been, where we are, and where we are going.
Here we are.
Are we going this whole crate?
You don't like my truck?
Oh, my word.
Oh, come on. It'll be an adventure. Wait till you hear this baby hum.
No seatbelt in this thing?
There's a lap belt down there. What could go wrong?
I could think of a few things.
There does seem to be something different about today. A generation ago or 2 generations ago, when people were starting to notice, we've detached from truth, we've detached from God, we've detached from the sources of human dignity. That's really my concern. It just seems like, wow, there are a lot of people feeling the loss of meaning, the loss of truth, the loss of identity, the loss of any purpose or calling to life. They're kind of feeling it up close and personal in a way that a generation ago they really weren't.
So you're seeing all the chickens coming home to roost. And so people really feel now that things are degenerating rapidly, and they are. Ernest Hemingway in his The Sun Also Rises has a famous description of bankruptcy. And one character says, how did it happen? And the other says, it happened 2 ways. First, gradually, and then suddenly. John, I brought something to show you and then something to give you. This is very special to our family, a family treasure. This is William Wilberforce's best-selling book in the early 19th century, sold in the hundreds of thousands, called Real Christianity. But he's written the book and signed it But more importantly, in the front is a letter written by the great man to a young couple he saw getting married. And he says, I want you to know the change in my life. But what's moving to me is when I saw the date, just a few months before he died. So the great man is still fighting slavery, and you know it was abolished 3 days before he died. But he's still reaching out in terms of his faith, and that is the best of the Christian faith, the best of evangelicalism. People who are actively engaged in life through their callings, but also prepared to share their faith in a wonderful way. John, I brought you a gift for yourself to keep. It's a copy of the great man's book we came across in an antique shop in Paris.
Oh, wow.
And I know you'll treasure it.
Oz, this is incredible. Thank you. And we all think, well, I'm no Wilberforce. There's not a real difference that I can make. But that's just not true. We can make a difference in the world. And we're in this time and place in history because God wanted us there. After this incredible journey you've had, here we are kind of in the area where I grew up, and I have learned so much from so many people talking about the large civilizational issues and really the crisis that the West is in. And I just am more convinced than ever this is now being felt on an individual and personal level. It's kind of what I learned as a theoretical, analysis of Western culture is being experienced by a lot of people as an existential loss of truth, of identity, of meaning and purpose. What is the way forward in this moment?
Well, you're right, John. I first came to the US more than 50 years ago, and in many ways where we are today is unrecognizable. So on our journey across Europe, tried to convey a biblical view of the sense of time and history, the moment, and then to look at the Western crisis, the way the West was inspired and shaped by the Christian faith, but has repudiated the inspiration that made it, and the Bible, the book that made it. And then look at the American crisis and see how the inroads, say, of secularism, postmodernism, cultural Marxism, other things that come in, and as you say, turn the world upside down.
There's something as deep as the human experience goes that we're missing. And so it's not going to be a political solution. It's not going to be an economic solution to this. We have to go back to what is true. Doesn't that require that we do more than just kind of know the truth and believe the truth? I mean, we got to love the truth. We've got to embrace the truth. We've got to live the truth. It's got to be more than just kind of a theoretical concept that we assent to, but what does it look like? What kind of people are people who choose truth?
And it'll be eventually all up to each of us in our spheres. I used to know Francis Schaeffer, and among many of the things he was famous for was the line, "There are no little people." In other words, every single one of us counts. We all matter. Everyone made in the image of God. Everyone, everywhere, in everything. It can turn around.
All right, so there's a lot there. There's a lot going on in that, a lot of really interesting and thoughtful people. A few of those characters in the second half. We'll get to know some of their stories in a little bit more depth. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is one of those specifically, so she will be definitely good to know, and some others as well as we get around to the second half. A lot of those big ideas, and over time, we're going to try to dip into some of those. If some of those stuck out to you, make sure that you come and talk to me and stick that bug in my ear, and if we have time, we'll make sure we'll fit some of that in as well. What I want to do for the next few minutes is talk a little bit about that big idea that sort of opened this up, the notion of our civilizational moment, what Os Guinness means by that, why I am doing this particular series, and then because it showed up in his story in a fascinating way, I want to talk for another couple of minutes about what happened in China in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, because it is one of the most dramatic examples of what happens when a civilization goes bad. And it's something that a lot of Westerners may know a little bit about, but maybe not enough about. And so it's valuable to know some of that also. Here's a little bit about why I am doing this. And so this has the thoughts that are sort of guiding me as we walk through this study. The West was built on a Judeo-Christian tradition rising out of the Bible. The ways in which that is the case, the specific ways, I think are going to surprise us sometimes. And so I'm hopeful that over the next few weeks, we'll kind of be pleasantly surprised with, well, what exactly does that mean? And so as we walk through that, I think it's going to be enlightening. It's going to be encouraging. It's going to help us find even more of the courage of our own faith and what we believe and what we take for granted. This has been a profound good for people at all levels of society, which I think is a demonstrable truth. The attempt to weaken or replace it will only be destructive and will inevitably lead down a ruinous path. And that's what they're worried about. That's why they've put this together. This is why Os Guinness and these others write and speak and do the things that they do. If you're not familiar with Os Guinness, go on Amazon.com, buy one of his 73 books that he has written. He writes like crazy. The last several books he has written have been on this issue specifically. They're provocative, they're thoughtful. Clearly, he has a grasp and a way of communicating what's going on. One of the most recent books that he wrote is actually called Our Civilizational Moment, and it's about this. So in that book, this is how he defines that, and he uses those three concepts that he mentioned at the very beginning of the documentary. A civilizational moment is a critical transition phase in the rise, course, and decline of a civilization when a civilization loses its decisive connection with the dynamic that inspired it. Such a moment must then issue in one of three broad options: renewal of the dynamic that inspired the civilization in the first place, a successful replacement of the original dynamic by another, or the decline of the civilization, and perhaps the birth of a new and different civilization late in time and elsewhere in the world. So there are his three categories for this moment: renewal, replacement, or decline. So the renewal of a civilization is the reattachment to its basic fundamental building block concepts and ideas. The Judeo-Christian tradition, and specifically how that comes out of the Word of God. Is there another civilizational idea, ideology that can actually replace the Judeo-Christian tradition? If someone decides that it has gone wrong, is fundamentally rotten to the core, is there something else that can replace it and do better? And they're making the argument that many parts of the Western world are at exactly that moment. Should we replace it? There are many who think we should, and why? And then decline. All these great empires and civilizations of history have their moment, and then centuries later, someone digs up their biggest buildings and nobody knows what they were, right? So renewal, replacement, or decline. These are the things he's interested in. And so I do want to spend a moment or two. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to describe the entire Chinese situation in the 20th century for you. So there you go. See, this is what happens on these Tuesday nights. It's stunning when you learn that Os Guinness, and you kind of learn who he is, grew up the first 10 to 15 years of his life in and out of China during all of that upheaval, and then even in the first couple of years of Mao's China. That means he lived through and is trying to describe to us some of the most bleak and bloody moments in history, especially in the 20th century. So a little bit of what he was describing there, as he described his early life and the troubles that they found themselves in. By the 1920s, the last Chinese dynasty had fallen apart. There were Western nations who had come in, and they were building cities and taking over ports, and so there was Western influence. The last Chinese dynasty had fallen. You have a group of nationalists, so Chinese nationalists, who are then trying to rebuild the nation itself and unify it. But China's a great big country, physically, geographically, culturally. So the nationalists are having a difficult time reuniting China since the fall of the last dynasty. This is happening during the 20s and 30s. During that time, the Japanese Empire decided to take advantage of the chaos, and so they invaded northeastern China, or Manchuria. He mentioned just very briefly an event called the Rape of Nanking, or the Rape of Nanjing. It was a city they lived in after World War II. In 1937, the Japanese army made their way to this relatively important and large city in Manchuria, China. And by that point in time, the battle between the nationalists and the Japanese Empire, and in another part of China, the growing CCP. So the Chinese Communist Party was in its very early stages at this point. A lot of chaos, a lot of war, a lot of death. By the time the Japanese got to Nanking, they had adopted not just a scorched earth policy, but basically an atrocity policy. So some of these atrocities are still trying to be covered up, but enough of them are being found. Over 200,000 people just in this one city, and this is after people had fled the city by the hundreds of thousands. 200,000 tortured and killed in some of the most gruesome and unbelievable kinds of ways. Difficult to describe, difficult to wrap our heads around. So much so that when we think of the atrocities of World War II or that era, we think of the concentration camps in Auschwitz and others. There are many who believe that what happened in Nanking rates amongst the worst atrocities during the World War II era. So this is going on inside of China, a lot of upheaval. So in the 1920s to the 1940s, you have now, he mentioned that they were caught in a three-way battle in China. The Japanese imperialists, the nationalists who were trying to unite the nation, and then the growing Chinese Communist Party that had gotten started during that time. So during the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, this son of a peasant made his way into the party through a lot of death and battle and intrigue. He remains alive and powerful. He rises to the top of the CCP, and it is Mao Zedong who rises to the top. And so in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party finally walks into Tiananmen Square, into the sacred city. He announces himself as the head of the Communist Party, as the supreme leader of China. So the official Cultural Revolution begins in 1949. During that time, you've got American influence and Russian influence trying to figure out who to support in China, because it's very confusing. It's during World War II. Russia and the U.S. are sort of aligned against Germany, but then you've got Japan doing this. You have communists that are trying to expand into China. So it's an absolute international mess during that time. But there's been enough international support from the Russian Communist Party that they finally rise to the surface and they make themselves the leaders. And so the great leap forward was Mao's version of what Stalin was trying to do in Russia with what he called his 5-year plans. So Russia was well behind the West when it came to industrial production. So Stalin had instituted these quotas in these 5-year plans for industry and for farming. So he's imposing these 5-year plans. It goes horribly wrong. This is the starvation of the famine in Ukraine. All kinds of things happen. Mao is trying to do the same thing. He calls it his great leap forward. But the Chinese culture is so far behind in their industrial work, they don't have factories, but what they have is roughly 600 million peasants. So Mao throws peasants at all of this work instead of trying to throw people into factories to build steel mills and cars and trains and so on and so forth. As he does that, the Chinese Communist Party nationalizes all land, all property, everything. They take people off of their land, they put them into giant communes, and they make them farm their rice paddies. And the Chinese Communist Party would confiscate all of the harvest and then give back a percentage. During that time, you have years and years worth of man-made famines. And it was just during that time, that doesn't even include the people who died, as Os Guinness described, before 1949. From 1949 until the late 1950s, between 45 and 70 million people died in China because of the Great Leap Forward and communist policy. It's called democide. It's when a government kills its own people. Mao was not a fan of the peasant. He is on record in several different ways with all kinds of sadistic things. One of the most dramatic is that one of his policies was that the only way for the Chinese people to move forward was to kill half of his own citizenry. It's the only way they'd make their way forward. So he would set goals amongst his army for the number of peasants they had to kill on a regular basis. So you get rid of famine by getting rid of mouths to feed. This is how incredibly ridiculous the Communist Party's work. These kinds of things happen in Russia too, but with the farming in China. One particular story, the famine is so bad, Mao decides that we can't blame it on me or on our policies. So he literally blamed it on the sparrows stealing rice. So the Chinese Communist Party at the time set a quota for the number of sparrows that everybody was supposed to kill in China. And sure enough, in a couple of years, they had killed just about every single sparrow in China, which of course leads to an insect and rodent problem, which kills the next harvest, right? So this is the way communists think. And so this is the way Mao thought. And so things were going very, very badly inside of China. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. Inside of the Cultural Revolution, there was this thing where there was a program that Mao instituted called Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom. There were enough people who were disagreeing with him that what he did from the top is he said, let's air our differences. If you disagree with me, I want you to come forward. I want you to express yourself in the public square. We're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Well, does it take much imagination to think what happens next? All that was a plan to get his detractors out of the open for imprisonment and execution. The stories go on and on and on with what happened in China under Mao and communism, especially specifically. Civilizational evil is real. It is significant. It is profound. The way governments work and the ideologies that run and build governments really do make a difference. When Ayaan Hirsi Ali is talking about the structure she grew up inside of Somalia, that's just not a random thing because they live in Africa. It's because of the system that ran that government, that ideology, its regime. It's the way the government works. When we watch something like this in Mao's China, communism takes, kills, and benefits the powerful. This is just what communism does. This is just what socialism does. Communism is expansionist and it is inflexible. There are no other parties in power. There are no legit elections. Communism can't just take over Shanghai or Nanjing. It has to take over the entire nation. It wants to spread itself. That is the fundamental ideology behind Marxism and its global desires. The way people are used. This idea was clear throughout those interviews that they kept putting forward, and this is very real. They kept putting forward that the thing that makes Western civilization fundamentally different from other civilizational concepts or ideologies is the dignity of every single human being. Well, if you're killing tens of millions of your own people, those people are not dignified human beings. They're just numbers. They're just things to get rid of or to use until they die. So these kinds of ideologies genuinely matter. People become expendable. They become statistics. People serve the state. They end up serving the leader. Inside of a nation that experienced famine after famine after famine, believe it or not, Chairman Mao may have been the only overweight man in China. He ate just fine. He had everything he needed. It is socialism and communism that builds a genuine 1% to 99% of culture. That is where it genuinely actually happens. And sure enough, it happened in Mao's China, in the Soviet Union, and on the story goes. Always the case is, with religion, no higher power can be admitted. Even if on some level, some version of religion is allowed, it is not allowed to have influence in the public square. Because the moment you do that, you have an authority that stands above the state. And so citizens will then begin to believe things like the state that I am under is accountable to someone over them, right? So I can hold my state accountable to that higher power, to that authority, to God, and to God's standards. And so you've got to get rid of that notion. You have to pull that notion down. You have to oppress that notion. So no higher power admitted. The state serves the role of God, and that is the final line when it comes to civilizational collapse, especially in Marxism, communism, and socialism. So they're trying to make the point here, and we'll be touching on it in our time together. Civilizations are just not the same. They're not replaceable one for the other. It's not the case that this is just what happens and one thing is going to lead to the next and it's going to be just fine on the other side. These fundamental concepts lead to profound fundamental differences on the street, right? The way that people's lives work. A Judeo-Christian civilization is not the same as communism and socialism. And if you've got your eye open for this, there's still a lot of individuals inside of the Christian world who are writing books and making the argument that not only was Jesus a socialist, the Bible is socialist. I disagree with that profoundly. I think for some of the reasons that we've already seen, but there are a lot of others as well. Wokeism and cultural Marxism, they've brought it up. One of the individuals, Neil Ferguson, said it's just a cult. You use special language. There are special rituals that you're involved with. We'll end up talking about that because I believe there's an entire theology inside of the woke worldview. And once we kind of outline that, again, I think it's going to enlighten us and help us see what's going on in the world around us. Islamism, Ayaan Hirsi Ali grew up in it. She literally escaped it with her life. She will tell her story in the second half of this documentary. And so here she is in the West, sounding the alarm. She writes a lot. She's the head of a media group right now. She has her head above the water level. So she's out there doing her thing, trying to warn the West specifically about Islamism. Her story is just absolutely beautiful. One of the thoughts, one of the terms that stuck with me came a little bit early inside of what we watched. One of the men being interviewed used the image of alternative fuels, that we have this engine of civilization that's been built by the Judeo-Christian worldview that comes right out of the Word of God and directly influences Western civilization. So now we have these forces who are trying to run that same engine on alternative fuels. Will these same concepts stick? Will we continue to build the way that we have built? Is there going to be another Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach if we replace the Judeo-Christian worldview with wokeism, right? Can we stick something else in this engine and just keep humming right along? And these guys are making the argument that this is absolutely not the case, but this is what's happening. He mentioned as well the difference between the French and the American and English revolutions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The French Revolution was built on, he said, anti-God, anti-Christian, anti-civilization kind of ideas. The American Revolution has at its core the belief, and the building of the Constitution has at its very core the belief that human beings are frail individuals. We are not purely angelic in our nature, so we require the separation of powers and accountability and responsibility through the way powers work. The French Revolution is based a lot on the philosopher René Descartes, who believed that human beings are basically good but are corrupted by the institutions around them. So if you believe, he said, human beings are born basically good, but everywhere they're in chains. They're being actually torn apart by the institutions around them. And if you believe that, then what you have to do is tear down institutions so that human beings can be free. And to do that, you're going to spill a lot of blood. By the time the French Revolution was done, by one account, at least 20,000 priests had been beheaded. That's just priests, because they wouldn't stop doing what they were doing inside of the Catholic Church. So these are the difference in revolution. So when Os Guinness says, this civilization was born out of one, but we're choosing another, he's talking about some very specific ideologies. All right. So there's a little bit of reflection on this first half. Again, some great big ideas. By the way, I've been a fan of David Berlinski for a very long time. Anybody who can sit on a couch like that and casually say, we've been run by dumb people for a very long time, that's a life worth emulating. You're right. You're a philosopher in Paris, and you can just drop into a couch for the rest of your life. You're going to be just fine. A lot of these people have a lot of really good things to tell us. And so we'll kind of walk through the lives of some of these individuals, what they write and speak and why they do it, and these ideas as well. So I'm looking forward to this. Next week, I think it's going to be fun as well as we watch several stories unfold, and not just their stories, but Christ at work in their lives. It's just really moving. So let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this time together tonight. We ask, Lord, that you would guide this study, that you would help us, Father, through it, to be able to put words and ideas to what we see and what we feel. Lord, that we would understand what's going on around us a little bit more clearly, that we would, Father, be encouraged in our faith, that the thing that our faith is grounded on, the Word of God, the things that you have revealed to us, that, Lord, these are civilizational changing truths. These are things that are good, not just for me and my salvation and my life, but they're good for my neighbor as well in profound ways. Through this, grant us, Father, the hope that Christ gives us. Grant us, Father, the wisdom and courage that each of us needs to walk into this world carrying these truths with us. We pray this, Father, in your blessed and glorious name. And the church said, amen. We'll see you all next time.